As far as the PowerPoint is concerned, I'm sorry, but if you go back and you look at it online, it's not going to be there. It's too big. It's too big of a file. So it is only going to be here in the class. But I will have notes. If someone wants the notes, I can give them the notes. I actually had someone write me the other day that had just, remember the church out in Missouri that had looked at the lessons on YouTube and watched some of them, I guess, and wanted some of the outlines, and so I'll be doing that. But yeah, we have a good opportunity here to study some things. These are things that I don't. I'm having to study, and I actually get kind of caught going down the rabbit hole with some of this stuff because I don't know everything. I even sometimes have to look up words because. And I left one in today so that you could see it. When we get there, you'll be interested. I think most of you, if not all of you, will be in the same shoes I was in and go, "What is that word? What does that mean?" And then when I tell you, you're going to go, "Oh, okay, I see it. I see that now." But it is really interesting. But the first thing we need to do is we're going to establish some things here with the early British church. This is going to be, I believe, a two-parter, possibly three. I believe it'll be just two parts. But the early British church, and it starts basically, of course, with the Great Commission. In Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, we see the Great Commission being given. Of course, it says, "And Jesus came to them and spake unto them, saying, All authority hath been given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the world." So when you look at this, we have the Great Commission. It's given. We know that it's been passed down from generation to generation because of verse 20 there. But there's a little bit more to this that we need to describe because Paul writes something about the Great Commission in Romans chapter 1 and verse 8. It says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is proclaimed throughout the whole world." Now, you go back into the book of Acts, and there's even more history here showing that the world has been reached with the gospel. Now, what does that mean? I've heard a lot of people describe different things, but then I want to describe a little bit more in this class. And so, in order for us to really do this, we have to have a greater context of what people say, and then the reality of what has happened in the spreading of the gospel and how it got to Europe and to Britain. So the Great Commission, of course, when you look at the histories, if you go and you were just you probably Google this and you'd probably get this answer right here. But the question would be, when did, Christianity come into, and we're not talking about the Catholic Church, when did Christianity come into to Britain? Well, they teach that Christianity came into Britain in 597. But when it arrived, that was the Catholic Church. That's what it was. 597. That's when Christianity hits Great Britain here. But we know that, of course, Paul's inspired writings. We understand that religion was professed throughout all the parts of Roman dominions, and we see also that. When you're thinking about this idea of going and proclaiming this word, the idea that the proclamation was to be given to everybody would have to assume at the time, because we know that people in the first century were in Britain, that would have to include Britain, and so the British Isles has to be included in this. All right, let's look at some things here. Let's start with the history between the Celts and the Romans. Now, This is this is really interesting stuff. I've studied all kinds of history. For the degree I initially got, we had to study Western civilization, and so that's pretty interesting stuff. There is some religion aspect of it, but then also we studied church history. We learned about some of the things that happened in America, but by and large, all this stuff was not there. We learned some things about British history only because you need to know enough. Of course, what are we taught here in America? We're taught about leaving Britain. we learn about leaving that country and coming here and starting a new country. So we only learn enough history to know, well, this is what was going on at the time. This is what was the problem, and this is why people came to settle America. So we get that. We've been taught that, but there is a whole lot more to it. I've got a lot of quotes here, and I'm really sorry for that, but hopefully you can read some of these. The print's probably going to be pretty small because there's a lot on these. But anyway, the setting for the introduction of Christianity to Britain is the background of really the animosity between the Celts and the Romans. I guess really, show of hands, does anybody have any sort of knowledge of this type of history of the Celts? Yeah, okay, so we're all in the same boat. I didn't know anything until I started studying this. So for several centuries, the Celts and Gauls had been at enmity with the newly emerging Roman state. Around 390 BC, the Gauls wreaked havoc throughout Italy, finally arriving at Rome. And the Romans engaged with the Celtic leaders, the king Brennus, for terms that would ensure that they would depart. So they're wanting to get the Celts out of Rome. And so the Celts would leave Rome for the price of 1,000 pounds of gold. They wanted a weight of gold. Now, here is a quote regarding the terms here. All right, so Quintus Sulpicius conferred with the Gallic chieftain Brennus, and together they agreed upon the price, 1,000 pounds weight of gold, the price of a nation soon to rule the world. Insult was added to what was already sufficiently disgraceful, for the weights which the Gauls brought for weighing the metal were heavier than standard, and when the Roman commander objected, the insolent barbarian flung his sword into the scale, saying, "Vivictus, woe to the vanquished," words intolerable to Roman ears. So they're not really concerned with relations, right? They wanted their money, and they came to cheat and get more, but of course this doesn't work out. The Romans, of course, then what would anybody do? They refused to hand over the gold, and in the time the Celts had to be removed from Roman territory by force, and so they're just kind of a thorn in the side of the Romans. Now in the book Traces of the Kingdom, it says this: later in 279 BC, an army of Celts invaded Macedonia and northern Greece. The following year, they crossed the Bosporus and settled in a part of Asia Minor that came to be called Galatia. It was to these settlers, some of whom had become Christians, that Paul wrote the Galatian letters. Now, if you look at of course, these are the Gauls going, they form Galatia, and then later you have what we now know as France. So, when you think about it in those terms, you go, oh, okay, that kind of makes some sense. And two, it's kind of funny if you think about the French and how, if you know anything about French people and you read Galatians, you can kind of see some similarities. Not exactly, but there are some similarities there. So as Rome grew in power, they sought the destruction of the Celts, but they had they had to get rid of their religious system. Basically, they're trying to get rid of the Celtic priests and leaders, and they were called the Druids. You probably have heard that and thought, I whenever I heard the Druids, I thought, well, maybe that sounds like a group of people. It's not really a group of people. It's not a nation, but it's a religious group, and it's a pagan group, if you will. Druids were strong in Britain. They taught the resurrection of the body, and they taught a need for atonement for sin. But these people are not, Christian in nature. These are simply just pagan people. Edward Davies says that the favorite maxim of the Druids was to worship gods, to do no evil, and to exercise fortitude according to Gaulish tradition. In the time of Caesar, Druidical discipline originated in Britain. The same account is confirmed by the institutional triads of the British Order. According to Julius Caesar, confirming the Celtic origin of the Gauls in the 6th book of his Gallic Wars, the Gauls affirm they are all descended from a common father. So, you can see this is one of those counterfeit things, counterfeit religion, where you have a general principle, and they just kind of, they're kind of copying what they see and have heard from the Bible. You can see this because, they're descended from a common father, dis, D-I-S, and say this is the tradition of the Druids. So this is what Caesar, that Julius Caesar said of the Druids. Normally, the Romans, if you recall, when we first started these lessons, we talked about the Romans quite a bit. And what do you remember about that? Do you remember, were they tolerant or intolerant towards those of various religions? They were exceptionally tolerant. That is not the case when it comes to Druidism. There is no compromise for the Romans for some reason. They just are not having it. They just don't want it at all. Going back to the book Traces of the Kingdom, prior to Christianity arriving in Britain, the Romans had forced the Druid priesthood north into Wales and eventually Scotland, slaughtering many in the process. The Druids fled to Anglesey, an island off northwest Wales, which was a holy isle, much loved by the heathen. Some fled further north and found their way into what became Scotland, which never fell into Roman arms. So, you see that there is a problem with the Druids. They get rid of them. They're pushed kind of out of the land. They go into Scotland, and so they're just trying to get rid of these people out of these Roman territories. Now, looking to the next part, we need to talk about the early records of the church in Britain. There's a lot to this section, but the earliest record of Christianity, of it arriving in Britain, actually comes in the year 37. Now think about that. When do we have a pretty good idea when Christ died. When was that? 33. So 4 years later, you have someone going into Britain. So this is like really right after everything is getting started. Although historians dates it later, they date it around 58 to 63. This is something that's commonly done. But Eusebius in the 4th century church, he wrote, "Some have crossed the ocean and reached the Isles of Britain." And in this discussion, looking for something here. In this discussion, he's saying, look, from early on, you have them crossing over the oceans and coming to Britain itself. Now, some people have mistakenly thought that the oceans could not be crossed When you think about the Vikings, that was a big deal for them, trying to cross the ocean. They thought that it couldn't be done, but that was the Vikings that thought that they couldn't be done. They're kind of isolated. They tried doing this several times, and they finally figured it out. But this has been done for a long time, before even the Vikings.
They could have took supernatural powers with them.
What is that?
They could have took miraculous powers with them.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly. And I was actually going to talk about that at some point. I think it's interesting to think about that. Like I think we mentioned it last week, that like what did they do like today, I went to preaching school. I studied the Bible. I have the Bible. Even if I hadn't gone to preaching school, I could just open up the Bible. They didn't have that. What did they have? They had spiritual gifts. They had to have those in order to do the worship. What's that?
Revelation and confirmation.
Yeah, revelation and confirmation. Moving back into this, there's a man named Gildas. He's an ancient British historian. He wrote around AD 564 and affirmed that the Britons received the gospel under Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus, born Tiberius Claudius Nero, 42 BC to 37 AD, the emperor under whom Christ suffered. And so he's saying, look, this has entered into Britain. This, Gildas is saying this is what happened. You had them entering into Britain very soon after learning about the Christ. Many evangelists are sent. You have the first planters of the gospel, going out, and they continued. Actually, this is going back to Gildas. He says they continued with them until the cruel persecution of Diocletian, the emperor, about 290. Gildas' British name may have been Badonicus, born in the year 520 AD. He notes that Christianity was propagated without impediment, and death threatened to those who interfered with its professors. So, unlike what you get in most places of the world, when they go to Britain, there is nothing hindering the church being spread. There's nothing hindering the gospel. Nobody is stopping anybody from teaching. There isn't persecution, but those are threatened with death who interfered with spreading the gospel. Now, that's interesting, right? That's quite the opposite of what has happened in most places of this world. During this time, the Druid priesthood had been banished, and it allowed for the free spread of Christianity. Tertullian wrote in 160 to 225, this is his lifespan. He, writing of the spread of Christianity throughout the world, stated, "In the haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ," showing that even as early as his time, they're saying that really didn't come until when? Almost in the 6th century is when they're saying. The 6th century is when this happened. But here, Tertullian, who's writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, is already saying they've got the gospel in Britain. So this is just falsehood that people are misunderstanding. Theodoret, he lived 393 to 466, confirms the pre-Augustine of Canterbury mission to Britain, stating the message of Christ has been preached and established prior to the Roman Catholic mission of Augustine of Canterbury in 597. So again, another person saying that the British Isles, everything has been they have been taught the gospel, and this has happened hundreds of years before they said that it actually happened. So why is that important? It's important because we already know they got it wrong. People are saying, the church wasn't here. And even when it was, what are they saying? They're saying that it's 6th century is when the church came, and then that was the Roman Catholic Church. But the church was there, the true church was there way before that. All right, so going back into this, Augustine, or Augustine really, is considered the apostle to the English. But this is just not true, because all the English have been taught already before he ever gets there. Crosby, a historian, mentions this. I think you're going to find this pretty interesting. Claudia Rufina was an English convert to Christianity. She claimed she was, the historian claims this, claimed she was wife to Pudens, a Roman senator. Claudia, mentioned by Paul in 2 Timothy 4, verse 21, is what they're saying. But look at this, okay? Look at 2 Timothy 4 and verse 21. It says, "Give diligence to come before winter. Eubulus saluteth thee, and Pudens, and Linus, and Claudia, and all the brethren." And so they're saying, look, here's Claudia, married to Pudens, and they're coming over, and she was British. She was British. Now there's more to this. Crosby said, Tacitus says that Pomponia Graecina, wife of Pelagius, and Claudia Rufina, a British lady, are supposed to be of the saints that were in Caesar's household, mentioned by Paul in Philippians 3. Now that's pretty interesting, going back to the 1st century and having some of these kind of connections. Pelagius was in Britain in AD 45, and it is probable that Claudia returned with him, and it has been thought from the statement of Tacitus that this lady was the first British Christian. Speed, I know this is funny, but that's a name. Speed, a British author on ancient history, says that Claudius sent Paul's writings, which he calls spiritual manna, unto her friends in Britain to feed their souls with the bread of life. Now, going back, we referenced this earlier without actually looking at the passage, but in Acts chapter 9 and verse 15, it says, "But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." So here it is. You've got kings mentioned here. The kings of Britain should hear the gospel, and they should not be thought of as strange as to not having heard the gospel. So this is kind of in the same thought process. This is going out. Paul is going to be reaching a lot of people, and certainly if Paul has taught these people, that is how he reaches other places. That's the beauty of all this stuff. I have been pretty excited about some things. I've always wanted to kind of know how this feels, but when me and my friend Ryan we wrote the book together, one of the things that I told him I was really interested in was basically being able to teach other people but not have to be there. I mean, the theory is good when you're thinking about sermons online, but you don't hear anything about that. Well, we printed the book, and we had some people buy it. I gave some copies out, and we started hearing back from brethren, and how we had one person said that there was a congregation that they were a part of that they were not teaching the truth on drinking alcohol, and they read the book, and they went and they actually ordered 6 more books to take to their elders and deacons and said, "You need to read this. Here's what the truth is on the matter." And I was so excited about that. I went back to my friend Ryan and I said, "You know what the best part about this is? That I've never met this person, and I might have even been asleep at the time that they're reading this. I don't know. I'm working basically, but I'm not working." And so I was like, tell them I'm all excited about that. And we've had several other people that have written, given us, or talked to us about these things. And you think about that, that's exactly what's going on with Paul, except on a greater scale, right? He's an apostle, and he's reaching all these people, and, you know, this is just one mention here. He's, if the references are true, you know, he's referencing people that have gone off to Britain, and they have, you know, spread the gospel. He's taught them, they've gone and done much more work. And that's one of those things I heard a lot, and it kind of made me excited for the teachers at the Memphis School of Preaching whenever I was there, because they would talk about how, you know, they were teaching these students, and then these students were going to go and teach others, and that, you know, it was just exciting for them to do that, because how many souls are going to be saved because they're just teaching. They're just teaching other men to go and teach. And that is a really exciting thought in and of itself. But what we're seeing right here is the playing out of that. It is reaching all over the world. All right, so all of this being said, we need to look at the next thing. This is I kind of messed up my outline here. This is the next point. We need to look at the Roman influence in Britain. The Roman influence in Britain was to decline when in 410, the last of the Roman soldiers and officials left Britain. Now, I've got a few, I've cut out some stuff. If you wanted to go and look at this, you could, and I'll give you the references for all this stuff, but I've cut out only the things that are really pertinent to us, so it might seem like we're kind of jumping in midway. That's because we are. We don't need the rest of the history here to understand what's going on. But I think you say this, Ninius, maybe? I don't know, Ninius. Probably Ninius, I guess. But anyway, he is a historian in the 8th century. Does not date this, but presumably this writing was before the invasion of AD 43. A previous invasion happens in 55 BC, and that had failed. All right, so here's the quote. Thus, agreeable to the account given by the Britons, the Romans governed them 409 years. After this, the Britons despised the authority of the Romans, equally refusing to pay them tribute or to receive their kings, nor durst the Romans any longer attempt the government of a country, the natives of which massacred their deputies. Now, being a fan of history and thinking about American history, I kind of thought, you know, when you're thinking about the Revolutionary War, oh, how the tables have turned, right? This is exactly describing what they didn't like. They didn't like the Roman government being there. So what did they do? They killed their deputies and stuff. They are not happy with it. Now, we're going to find out a little bit more here in just a minute, but I thought that sounds exactly like what's going on. They're not paying tribute. Well, Americans that want to pay taxes to a government that was overseas, that didn't have anything to do with the colony. They didn't have anything to do with them at all. So it's just kind of interesting when you keep that kind of thought process in mind. It is just interesting how that, you know, they might have been, I don't know, I've never been there. I don't know how people look at the whole Revolutionary War aspect from Britain. I don't even know anybody. I know one person that's British, and I've never asked them this. But yeah, I wonder how they feel about this. But it would be funny if they were really angry with America because, you know, the Romans ought to be really angry with them then, because that's exactly what they did. They did the same things. They didn't like being subjugated. Now, this next part would be about AD 360. Ninius continues here. Thrice, now this is, you're going to have good eyesight for this. Monsu, you know, just listen, okay? You're not going to get that. All right. And this is not going to be the only one like this. I'm sorry. Thrice were the Roman deputies put to death by the Britons, and yet these, when harassed by the incursions of the barbarous nations, the Scots and the Picts, earnestly solicited the aid of the Romans. So here they are. Three times they revolt against the Romans. But what are they doing? They're asking for their help. They want their help. That's what's going on. To give effect to their entreaties, ambassadors were sent who made their entrance with impressions of deep sorrow, having their heads covered with dust and carrying rich presents to expiate the murder of the deputies. They were favorably received by the consuls and swore submission to the Roman yoke with whatever severity it might be imposed. The Romans, therefore, came with a powerful army to the assistance of the Britons, having appointed over them a ruler and settled the government, returned to Rome. And this took place alternately during the space of 348 years. The Britons, however, from the oppression of the empire, again massacred the Roman deputies and again petitioned for succor. Once more the Romans undertook the government of the Britons and assisted them in repelling their neighbors. And after having exhausted the country of its gold, silver, brass, honey, and costly vestments, and having besides received rich gifts, they returned in great triumph to Rome. After the above said war between the Britons and the Romans, the assassination of their rulers and the victory of Maximus, who slew Gratian, and the termination of the Roman power in Britain, they were in alarm 40 years. Vortigern then reigned in Britain in this time. In his time, the natives had cause of dread not only from the inroads of the Scots and the Picts, but also from the Romans and their apprehensions of Ambrosius. In Traces of the Kingdom, I gotta speed up here, or we're gonna be here for a while. In Traces of the Kingdom, it says, as can be seen, Britain was a country in considerable internal strife and civil war. Pagans were attacking the country from North Scotland. In answer, Vortigern, the British king, sought help from the German pagans. The breakdown of Roman law and civilization was swift, and the Roman military departed to counter the raids from the continental pirates, Vikings, Picts, and Scots. Towns would bring in mercenaries from northern Germany to defend them. These mercenaries were Angles and Saxons, who in time would become known as the English. Some of the British Celts moved into what is now Wales, but evidence of mass migration is lacking. The pagan religions returned to overthrow the Roman Catholic Church, which had taken the pagan temples, converting them to temples in eastern Britain. And so going back, we already mentioned Gildas. He writes here as well in the 6th century concerning the state of the southern and western Britain under apostate leaders. Now this is pretty scathing stuff, and here comes our really weird word. You won't be able to see it, I'm guessing, because of how small the print will be. But Gildas wrote here, Britain has kings, but they are tyrants. She has judges, but unrighteous ones, generally engaged to plunder and rapine, but always preying on the innocent. Whenever they exert themselves to avenge or protect, it is sure to be in favor of robbers or criminals. They have an abundance of wives, yet are addicted to fornication and adultery. They are ready to take oaths, and as often as perjure themselves, they make a vow and almost immediately act falsely. They make war, but their wars are against their countrymen and are unjust ones. They rigorously prosecute thieves throughout their country, but those who sit at the table with them are robbers. And they not only cherish but reward them. They give alms plentifully, but in contrast to this, a whole pile of crimes which they have committed. They sit on the seat of justice, but rarely seek for the rule of the right judgment. They despise the innocent and the humble, but seize occasion of exalting to the utmost the bloody-minded, the proud, the murderers, the combined and adulterers, enemies of God, who ought to be utterly destroyed and their names forgotten. They have many prisoners, and in there, this is the word. I don't know if you can see it. The word is G-A-O-L-S. It looks like they misspelled goals. Has anybody ever seen this word before? It is an old English word, and it is jails. It is jails. You just say it is a jail cell. That's what it is. It's jails. Prisoners in their jails loaded with chains, but this is done in treachery rather than in just punishment for crimes. And when they have stood before the altar, swearing by the name of God, they go away and think no more of the holy altar than if it were a mere heap of dirty stones. Yeah, this sounds a whole lot like modern day politics, doesn't it? Just corrupt. They're like, oh, they have lots of judges, but they're unrighteous judges. They have rulers, but the rulers are tyrants. That kind of reminds me, I hate to bring stuff up that it probably brings with it some sore memories, but during the whole pandemic thing, who was exempt from all of the mandates? Government. All these politicians and, maybe they weren't technically, supposed to be, but, you've got, people going to get their hair cut, not wearing a mask when it was they're mandated to wear masks. You got people that are only allowed to have so many people in a room and supposed to be wearing masks unless they're eating, and the politician comes, they have all these people and nobody's wearing a mask. They're all taking pictures with each other, and it's almost like, hey, look, here's the elites, here's the elite people, and then rest of you're just in this caste system. Now this is obviously, I think probably we might make some categorizations here of the same thing and say, hey, this looks like what we're going through, but I'm assuming that, just from reading the little that I have in British history, I'm assuming that it probably is worse than what we're seeing right now. It might be a little more tame today than what they're talking about, but the same general principle is applying. It matters who you know. You commit a crime, but somebody that's high up and a politician, then maybe you can get out of your punishment, right? We could talk about that for a while. This is not a politics class, but this is what's going on at the time. In the latter part of the 4th century, the Christian world would be wrought by the doctrinal dispute over infant baptism, free will, and marriage in the clergy. So let's look at this next point, and that is, let's look at Pelagius. Pelagius lived from 354 to 420 or 440. They don't really know. They have some discrepancies here. Has anybody heard? You probably heard the name Pelagius, right? Anybody know? Okay. Most people know. I think Philip said yes, so we got maybe one. So Pelagius, we'll learn a little bit about him. I don't want to jump ahead of myself. He is famous for his opposition to the doctrine of original sin. Original sin was developed by Augustine of Hippo, Pelagius is declared a heretic by the Council of Carthage. His defense of free will and good works became known as Pelagianism. He's saying, look, you've got free will, but also you have to do stuff. You have to work. Question, is that any different from what we teach? No, it's not any different here. I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was bringing up some things I learned about Pelagius over the last couple of weeks, and he said, I had someone call me a Pelagianist. And I was like, what? He said, yeah, you believe in Pelagianism. And he's like, I had a little bit of understanding of what, so he's like, I was able to refute it, but it's like, man, I'm not following Pelagian, But he was declared a heretic because he was defending free will, and he was defending the thought of good works, which are, from the scriptures. Now, Augustine of Hippo wrote in defense of the doctrine of original sin. He called Pelagius a holy man, and he wrote respectfully of him. This is what he said. This is another long quote that you're probably not going to be able to see. The questions which you propose that I should write to you about, in opposition to those persons who say that Adam would have died even if he had not sinned, and that nothing of this sin has passed to his posterity by natural transmission, and especially on the subject of baptism of infants, which the universal church, with most pious and maternal care, maintains in constant celebration. So here, this is all false doctrine. He's about to talk about Pelagius, by the way. I don't want anybody confused. And whether in this life there are, or have been, or ever will be children of men without any sin at all, I have already discussed in 2 lengthy books. And I venture to think that if in them I have not met all the points which perplex all men's minds on such matters, an achievement which I apprehend, nay, which I have no doubt lies beyond the power either of myself or of any other person, I have at all events prepared something in the shape of a firm ground on which those who defend the faith delivered to us by our fathers against the novel opinions of its opponents may at any time take their stand not unarmed for the contest. However, within the last few days I have read some writing by Pelagius, a holy man, as I am told, who has made no small progress in the Christian life, containing some very brief expository notes on the epistles of the Apostle Paul. I love how he notes that. He's like, look, I've written 2 lengthy books here. And this man, he's got some brief notes on the Apostle Paul, right? And therein I found, on coming to the passage where the apostle says, by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so it passed upon all men, an argument which is used by those who say that infants are not burdened with original sin. Now I confess that I have not refuted this argument in my lengthy treatise, because it did not indeed once occur to me that anybody was capable of thinking such sentiments. So I didn't think anybody's dumb enough to believe that. That's exactly what he said. I didn't believe anybody would be that dumb to think that, well, I got a dumb verse for you. You know, Ezekiel, was it 18 and verse 20? Or 20 and verse 18? I might give it, the soul that sinneth what? It shall die. Son doesn't bear the iniquity of the father. Father doesn't bear the iniquity of the son. We see, too, that children are innocent. This guy, doesn't know what he's talking about, but then he actually is belittling anybody that would believe what Pelagius is describing here, which actually is the truth of the matter, right? And so, it's interesting, but, I think that's hilarious. Not indeed once occurred to me that anybody was capable of thinking such sentiments. You got to be an imbecile to think this. Being, however, unwilling to add to that work which I had concluded, I brought it right to insert it in this epistle, both the argument itself and the very words in which I read it, and the answer which it seems to me proper to give it. So Pelagius, we find out, is well educated. He's fluent in both Greek and Latin. He's very learned in the Bible. He makes some good arguments here. He seemed to be trained in law and uses that to a good purpose. Lived a moral life. And this is interesting because this is at a time when debauchery was entering the apostate church in Rome, and it's just running rampant. He was a good orator. Gained a reputation for being very persuasive. He was blind in one eye. And then this was actually really funny that this was mentioned. I think this is mentioned for a reason, though. It says that he is not particularly attractive. Why is that important? That's kind of the same thing that's given about Jesus. Why is that important? That they're not attractive people. I'll let you answer this one. Why was that important? Does anybody have any ideas? Why is it important? You know what?
Less desirable to worship, I guess.
Right, less desirable to follow. You don't listen to some. Someone gets up and they, you've got the, going back to the whole politics thing. You get the handsome man that gets up in front of everybody, and people go, you know what? The men go, I want to be like that guy. And the women go, oh, he's so handsome. And then he says those great swelling words, and you go, you know what, I can follow this guy. He even looks the part, you know. It's not about the looks, it's about what's being said. And that's what this, same thing about Jesus. We're following Jesus because, well, he's easy to follow. He's easy to look at. He looks like he's, what was Saul? Remember Saul in the Old Testament? We're about to get to that on Sunday mornings. But Saul, what did he look like? He looked like a king. He was tall, strong, handsome. He looked like a king. What did Saul turn out to be? He turned out to be a bad king. So when they mention stuff like this, I think that's the importance here. He was blind in one eye, not a man that you would think, oh, people are going to follow him because of how he looks and what he might do. He defended free will. He taught baptism for the remission of actual sins, not original sin, and was opposed to inherited sin. He opposed infant baptism, arguing that an infant unbaptized who dies does not go to hell. To refute Pelagian heresy, so he's teaching against these things that the established churches were, they were teaching, the opposite of this. 2 bishops were sent, Germanus and Lupus, around 425 to 426, and they go and they go to refute him. But Christianity of Britain was more what is described as Palestinian in nature, that is more scriptural in nature, coming from the influence of what happened in Palestine coming over. But later it became Roman in origin. In Traces of the Kingdom, it says, it is interesting that when the argument over free will, good works, celibacy, and the clergy itself being in error, infant baptism, and original sin arose, it was learned Christians from the British Church who debated with the erring Roman Catholic Church. So for many, Pelagius kind of remains an enigma. I thought this was kind of an interesting thought. Obviously, we can't really say anything emphatically here. Of course, he was rejected and despised. Maybe the problem here, and this is what Keith Sisman said from Traces of the Kingdom, is that maybe the problem is that he was actually following the New Testament, and that people didn't like him for that. I think there are some things that maybe he taught that people have certainly found evidence in the Scripture against. I haven't gone that much in depth, nor have I really the time to do that. We don't have the time in this class. That's not what we're going to do. But evidently, there have been large volumes of books written about Pelagius. I'm sure there's lots of information out there. So at this point in history, paganism starts to take its toll. And this comes right out of Traces of the Kingdom. Whilst the Druids never returned to power they had before the Roman occupation of southern Britain, they did change the British Church by bringing in pagan doctrines. Easter and worship of the goddess of spring. Easter is one example. Another is the priesthood. Their white gowns are still used today in the Anglican Church, which are Druid in origin. So, paganism kind of infiltrates, and you see that the British Church, as in the establishment church of the state, that they're still using some of these things today, and this really branches off from paganism. Any comments, any questions? I know this is kind of a lot. This is a lot for me to take in. There was a whole lot more information. I just kind of picked through it because I was going, this is a lot. We could be here for a long time.
There's always been that question of people when it talks about the word went out to all the world. It's always been that question.
Yeah.
And the same question was with Alexander the Great. So he conquered the world.
Right.
And he cried because there's no more places to conquer.
Mm-hmm.
This includes Britain also.
Yeah.
Back in his day.
Yeah. Yeah, the known world is what people say, the known world.
Yeah.
Maybe there could have been some people that have, I've been asked about this before, like Indians, like Native Americans. How did that happen? And I think there's a pretty simple explanation. If you separate yourself off from a major group of people, you're going to do your own thing. And if you do that for long enough, you're going to have a drastically different system. I know that probably when, I don't know, I'm going to kind of go out here on a limb, but, West Virginia is pretty southern. But you go into Alabama, there's a big difference. You go over to Tennessee, there's a big difference. I found out that in Kansas, they are not southern at all. They don't know anything about southern phrases and hospitality and stuff like that. And so, it is just different. Story my father-in-law says, when they lived in Maryland, they walked into Walmart one time, and he greeted the greeter. They got the greeter at the front of Walmart, and he said, "Hey, how you doing?" And the guy goes, "Where are you from?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm from over in Damascus." And he goes, "No, where are you from?" You're not from here. And he's like, "Because you spoke to me." That's the thing. You're smiling and you're speaking to people. You're not from here. It's different in different places. It doesn't really take that long to get that way. Especially if you're isolated. If you're isolated, things can change pretty quickly. So, I think that's a big way in which, like the Native Americans could have happened. You get a small group of people that come and stay in a place for a long period of time that they've kind of isolated to themselves, become their own community. Let me ask you this. I know this is not the same exact thing, but how fast do cults get started? What do? They isolate themselves. They make their own compound. People start, think. Now, I know that's not the same exact thing, but that's how things happen like this. That's how societies can form. You go off and you do your own thing. You can really create your own society if you don't have a whole lot of outside influence.
People always come up to somewhere in the world where people don't know God.
Right.
And I say, I'm sure there is.
Right.
But at one point they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think just like the restoration, there's a continual need for us to continually preach the gospel, to continually fulfill that. They did that, but we need to continue to do that. If what they did in the first century was enough, what the apostles did, then we wouldn't have to do anything. That's just not true. We know that we need to do. There was a guy that we door knocked, and he was like a couple of streets over from the church building, and I just said, "Hey, we're inviting him to something," and he was like, "Church of Christ? I don't know what that is," and so this is Tennessee, this is Chattanooga, Tennessee, where this is happening. The guy has no clue. He has no interest in religion, really. And so, he didn't know anything. And so he says, "I hear people talking about Jesus Christ, but I have no idea what that is." And this is like an older man, too. And I'm like, in the Bible Belt, of all places. And it's like, if you want to be ignorant of something, you can be ignorant of something, But he just had no clue, had no care for it, Tried to explain it, and he just kind of, whatever. But yeah, you can see all kinds of wild stuff all over the place. But anybody have any other comments here, questions? All right, well, Brother Cleveland, go ahead and lead us in prayer.
Father,